Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Angela, and I am the Vice President of Education at the Immunodeficiency Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Before we start today's session, I'd like to go over a few reminders. First, please remember that each patient's treatment and condition is unique. The content presented in this session should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice. In all cases, patients and caregivers should consult their healthcare provider. Also, please remember that where you are on your journey of living with primary immunodeficiency may differ from that of others in the community. The severity of primary immunodeficiency can vary, and we ask that you be supportive and respectful of one another as fellow members of the IDF community. Questions for our presenter will be answered after the talk. So please submit your questions in the question box located at the bottom of your screen. And then our presenter will answer as many questions as possible during the session time. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our breakout session, Caring for the Caregiver. This session will be presented by Rebecca Wang. We call her Becky. Becky lives and serves as a licensed professional counselor at Partners in Change. Prior to this, Becky has assisted clients in effecting positive life changes through her work in a variety of clinical settings, to include psychiatric services at a local hospital, substance abuse treatment services, college counseling, and in private practice, working primarily with children, adolescents, and families. As a professional counselor, Becky provides a compassionate, holistic, client-centered approach that encourages genuine healing and wholeness to those she serves. At this time, I would like to turn this session over to Becky. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathy, and welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here today as we talk about caring for the caregiver. I'm going to begin by just doing a quick introduction of myself. As Kathy so graciously said, I am Becky, and I live in the middle of Michigan, where it is currently 72 degrees and beautiful, which is definitely not like our normal weather here. I am a lover of the beach and baseball, with some background as a licensed professional counselor. I am the mom of two young men who are actually 16, almost 17, and 19. And I've been a member of the IDF family for over 12 years now. So this is my connection to primary immunodeficiency disease. So the top picture there is my son's an immunologist, and my son there, his name is Christian. And that Christian was 5, and that was the day of his very first IVIG treatment ever. And there is us last summer at a baseball game, enjoying life. And so probably like many of you, I have had interesting experiences as a caregiver to a young person living with primary immunodeficiency. And so that's a good connection, I think, for this session. And when you add that to my therapy background, I think it makes for a good discussion on how we can help each other. So today's session, we're going to talk about the joys and the difficulties of caregiving. We're going to learn about caregiver burnout, and I'm going to give you 10 important tips to help prevent it and help to connect you with other caregivers, and just know that you are not alone in this process. So caring for a loved one with a chronic condition, no matter what that is, first of all, can be profoundly fulfilling. What I found in our experiences and in working with many caregivers is that it can be an experience that draws you closer to the one that you're caring for in so many ways. Now, having said that, it can also be extremely daunting, emotionally and physically challenging, and at many times very isolating. And all of those things in combination with one another can result in caregiver burnout. So caregiving is difficult. There was a study done back in 2019 that surveyed caregivers and asked some of their opinions on it. 88% of those surveyed, which was well over 20,000 in this sample, 88% of those said caregiving was more difficult than they expected. 57% of those folks said that it requires more emotional strength than they expected. And 52% said it requires more time than expected. And I can speak from my own personal experience and say that that is absolutely true. It is a very difficult job to, whether it's to be a parent and a caregiver, or a spouse and a caregiver, or maybe even a friend and a caregiver, however that works. So we're going to talk about 10 important tips to try to help prevent caregiver burnout. And that's the idea that when we aren't taking care of ourselves, it's really difficult to take care of other people. So the first tip is to become educated about primary immunodeficiency. And that's exactly what you're doing here at this conference, and probably many others like it that are held all the time through the IDF community. Knowledge is empowerment. I remember there was a time, early diagnosis with my son, where we were getting a lot of knowledge really fast, and it seemed really overwhelming, and it seemed so daunting at that time to really kind of dive in. But what I found was the more that I learned and the more that I was able to process it and move forward with it and join with people much like yourselves in a setting like this, or at different events that were held, we became like we didn't feel so alone anymore, and we learned so much, and that helped us. We were able to connect with IDF resources. If you're not familiar, the IDF has so many fantastic things available to all of you. To this day, I still download those resources to take to my son's school, or to share with my employer, or with friends and family who might want to understand more about my son's condition. Like I said, it helps us to connect with others in the community. And no questions are stupid questions at all. They're all really important. And so, whatever questions you might have in terms of caring for the person that you're caring for, it's always important to have those questions answered, whether it's from a therapist, or whether it's from a doctor, or even from the patient themselves. The second tip is to take care of yourself. Now, this is often difficult. We talk a lot about self-care and the importance of self-care, but sometimes as caregivers, we don't do a very good job of that with ourselves. So the first bullet there says, secure your own oxygen mask before assisting others. And that's an analogy that I think is really pertinent here. So if you've ever flown on an airplane, the flight attendants will do their pre-flight check, and they'll give you the spiel about how to make sure that you're safe on the airplane. And they always tell you, in the event of a drop in pressure in the cabin, to make sure to put your own mask on before anyone else's. And for a long time, I kind of thought, well, geez, if I were traveling with my child, for example, or my spouse, I would help them first instead of myself. But then the more I thought about that, that's not a good plan, because I need to be well so that I can help take care of other people. So that kind of applies to, I think, caregiving and what it is that we're doing. We can't pour from an empty cup. So if you're depleted, you're not able to be the best caregiver, but that is really difficult. The other thing is to not shy away from telling others that you are a caregiver. So, as a mom who cares for a young person with primary immunodeficiency, sometimes there have been times in my life where I've thought, well, that's my job. I'm his mom, right? So that's just part of what's expected of my role as a mom. However, when others understand what we're kind of living through and know that there's a role as a caregiver there, people will offer to help, or people will offer to support in some way that if they didn't know that about us, they may not have. And then finally, do not neglect your own physical and emotional health. There have been so many times in the process, both for myself and also working with folks who are caregivers along the road that we've been on, we don't take very good care of ourselves because oftentimes we're so busy taking care of our loved ones. And so when we do that, it becomes very difficult to caregive at times. So some of the strategies to do this are to practice healthy living. And these are not rocket science by any stretch of the imagination, but we don't do these with much regularity sometimes, especially when the stress of life and caregiving takes over. So things like eating a healthy and balanced diet, trying to get some fruits and veggies in your day, or kind of have, just something nutritious throughout your day if you're able to. Sometimes I remember when we were living in hospitals and going back and forth to many doctor's appointments, there would be days where I would get to the end and think, like, did I even eat today? And so obviously we want to make sure that we're doing well there. Trying to get some exercise regularly, whatever that is, and in whatever capacity that you're able to do that. So maybe that's you just take a walk around the block every day, or take your dog out for a run, or maybe you do some chair yoga, or you do some YouTube fitness videos in your home, whatever that is, just to kind of get you up and moving. Try to get enough sleep. Now, I know when folks say, when they told me that when I was going through having my son grow up with PI and all those challenges that come with that, like, oh, just get your 8 hours. I wish it were that simple. But to whatever degree that you can, really work on that sleep schedule, because everything feels bigger and more difficult when you don't have enough sleep. And then get and stay involved with your own interests. Sometimes caregiving can be really lonely. And when we lose those connections or don't develop connections with the things that we enjoy or the things that we really care about, it can feel very isolating. So this is another way to keep us mentally healthy. Going along with that is trying to remain social. Connecting with others in similar situations, much like we're doing here. I can tell you the first time that we met another family and another child with a primary immunodeficiency disease, like, it changed our world. The first time I heard someone say, oh my gosh, your story sounds like my story, me too, was probably one of the most beautiful days in my entire life, because it really meant that we weren't alone anymore and that somebody else really got it. And so no matter who it is that you're caregiving for, lots of people are caregivers across the board. And so in this community, you'll find plenty of caregivers, and everyone can understand to some degree what it's like to care for somebody that you love. Maintain other important relationships with your children, family members, and close friends. Sometimes when we're in the caregiving mode, we just hyper focus on the person that we're caring for, and sometimes that's really necessary. However, at times it harms the relationship, or we're not able to devote enough time to some of the other folks in our circle. That is such an important thing, to try to carve out whatever time that you're able to, because those relationships are super important. Find creative ways to get and stay connected to folks. In this day and age with the pandemic, depending on where you're at, we can find some challenges in how do we stay and get connected to the people around us. And this is one of those great ways, so I'm so glad that we're able to be and share this space together online today. But you can do similar things in your world. So maybe you have some kind of online meeting with your family and friends, or maybe you carve out a time to have a socially distant pizza party online, or I don't know, one of the things we do sometimes is my son will cook where he's at, and then I'll cook where I'm at, and we have the same ingredients for a meal, and then we're able to just do it online and do it together but apart. So finding those creative ways to connect with one another is critical. Don't become isolated yourself, even if the person you're caring for is homebound. And I know this is a huge, huge, huge challenge, but I can tell from personal experience that being able sometimes to just get out for 5 minutes, even if it's to run to Target or go grab a coffee, or to just take a quick walk around the block, or to take a few minutes out of your day to call one of your friends or family members and just talk about life or whatever's going on in your world, or to laugh a little bit, just trying not to become isolated yourself, because that will really drain a person. Accept help. This is such a difficult one for many of us, myself included. And I remember early on in my son's diagnosis, we were going through lots of different kinds of tests and hospitalizations and treatments. And early on, several of my friends would always ask, can we help you? Like, we're going to the grocery store and we're picking up some stuff. Can we get you anything? Can we bring you a casserole? Can we clean your house? Whatever. And I was always like, no, I got this. Because I kind of felt like I should be able to do this. I think many of us feel this overwhelming sense of, I can handle this. And while we can, gosh, sometimes that weight is really, really heavy. And so I had a friend one time, after about the millionth time I declined their opportunity for helping, finally said to me, do you know, every time you tell us no, you rob us of an opportunity to feel really needed and important and helpful in your life. And we love you and we care about you. And so what they said to me was, do you realize that allowing us to help you is a gift that you are giving us? And that was not anything that I had ever considered up to that point. And that certainly changed my entire perspective about asking for help. That it is a gift that others give us because they feel helpful in our lives. They feel like they're able to contribute something. And my goodness, when I finally was able to just say yes, even if it was somebody could drop a gallon of milk off at my house because I ran out and didn't have time to go to the store, or somebody dropped off a casserole for dinner, oh my gosh, that lifted the burden so that I had the emotional space sometimes to be able to go to bed a few minutes early, or I could spend more time with my other children, or however that looked. It really, really was a benefit to me. And so looking at asking for and accepting help as a strength instead of looking at it as a weakness. And then finally, do not attempt to be the super caregiver. I get wrapped up in this even to this day at times, although I even know better, but it's like I always feel this super urge to be able to do it all, right? Because as a mom, as a spouse, as a whatever role that we have, we kind of feel this urgency to be able to do it all. And that's just not possible. And so it's really empowering to cut ourselves some slack and give us some space so that we are able to breathe sometimes. It is not necessary for us to do everything. Acknowledge your emotions. This is really important. When we get into the process of caregiving, and some days are much more difficult than others, we almost go on autopilot at times. And so, if we're feeling any kind of emotion, sometimes we push that down so that we can continue to caregive. And you can do that for so long before those emotions start to bubble up and affect us. So if you're feeling hopeless or worthless or helpless or sad or anxious or fearful, it's important to acknowledge these emotions. This is why it's so important to carve that space sometimes to just breathe, to feel and experience these things. I will say that these emotions in our world, we've lived with PI probably my son's entire life, although he wasn't diagnosed until 5, but 17 years. And I can tell you that these feelings still kind of ebb and flow. And the most important thing about them is to acknowledge that they exist. When we battle them, we make them bigger. So sometimes it's just important to sit like it is, sit with it, and don't pretend that everything is like it used to be. I don't know about you, but when we got our PI diagnosis, everything in our world changed so substantially. And so some for the better and some things were more difficult, but pretending that everything was like it used to be doesn't help us. And we have to allow ourselves time to grieve the loss of our old life. This is critically important. If you're a caregiver of a child, maybe some of the things that you had hoped for your child, maybe those things have to look differently now. Or if it's your spouse or a friend, maybe the way your relationship looks changes, or the things that you had hoped for looks different. And so there is a grieving process with this. And that's not something that happens often in a short period of time. I find that the older my son gets, for example, as he's nearing college age, there are certain things about that experience for us that might look a lot different than what we had initially hoped for him. And then finally, if those feelings and emotions that you're experiencing become really overwhelming, it's a pretty normal response. So it's so important to seek help from a caring and trained mental health professional. Mental health professionals like myself are so available right now for the most part, especially with the pandemic, because a lot of insurance companies are allowing and continuing to allow therapists to see clients via teletherapy, so on the computer or on your phone, rather than you having to go to an office. So this is actually really good news, especially because it reduces germ exposure, and it also provides more access for folks to be able to talk to somebody about what they're experiencing. Allow for healthy expression of your feelings with each other. So whoever it is you're caregiving for, just because you're now a caregiver does not take away the fact that you have a relationship with the person. This is really critical. There were times when I would get into caregiver mode so much that it seemed like my role as a mom just wasn't as prominent anymore. And maybe as a spouse, for example, maybe you would feel that way as well. And so make time to nurture the basis of the relationship that you have with the person. Don't be reluctant to share your difficulties with the person that you're caring for. So there are times when my son and I will have conversations, and I will say things like, he might express that he's really frustrated about having to do his treatments, for example. And I might express similar frustration, that it's really difficult to have to watch him have to poke himself every week and have to live with that. Or that it's difficult sometimes when he doesn't always want to do his treatments. And so that can be kind of a battle at times. And so it's okay to talk about those things because they're really normal experiences. And often we can develop a shared understanding. And then should difficulties arise, again, there's couples therapy, there's family counseling, there's all sorts of things out there that can help folks navigate these different and unique challenges of being a caregiver, but even more importantly, being a caregiver of someone living with PI. Allow time for caregiving holidays, I call them. So this is like being able to take a little bit of time away. Now, again, I know that sounds great in an ideal world. It's more difficult than it seems on the screen for sure. But if you're able to get away with your guy friends or your girlfriends, even if it's to go have dinner or to make dinner at someone's house or whatever that is, to just step away from the environment, just to have some breathing room. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't pour from an empty cup. So if your cup is empty, there's no way that we can adequately care for and give to other people in our life. And so we really have to make a concerted effort to be able to keep filling our cup up and to surround ourselves with people who help to fill our cup up as well. Another strategy is to encourage the healthy independence of your loved one. And this might look slightly different depending on if your loved one is a child or adolescent, teenager, young adult, or an adult. But here's a few key options that you might consider. So the first one is to resist the urge to overfunction for your loved one. I know there were many times, and there still are, where I could probably do something quicker, faster, or I like to advocate. So I might advocate for my son when he's perfectly capable of doing that for himself. Or I might try to do something for him, which would just be out of the kindness of my heart. But he sometimes will say, well, Mom, I can do that for myself. So as good caregivers and loving the people that we love, right, we have a tendency sometimes to do more than is necessary. The other thing is to empower our loved ones. So when we overfunction, we kind of take the power away from the people that we're caregiving for. And so what we want to do is empower them to make good choices for their lives and for their health. And so how that looks in my example with my young person is, now that he's almost 17, we've been doing this for a while. We encouraged him when we switched over to sub-Q treatment that eventually we wanted him to be able to poke himself and to do those treatments on his own. And then he got pretty good at that. And then instead of us managing his doctor appointments and going with him as he's gotten a little bit older, we're giving him more latitude and allowing him to do those things and encouraging him to have the questions for his doctor and let him kind of take the lead in those situations. Because with children, especially, they're going to grow into adults who need to do these things anyways. For adults, sometimes, if we're living with PI or we're caring for someone who is as an adult, sometimes it's just hard. It's really hard to live with PI, so encourage. And then also assist your loved one in finding their voice. it can be really tough when you are living in this overwhelming world of PI and getting diagnosed and having to understand treatment options and doing the treatments and getting sick and navigating all the things that we have to navigate. But it's so important to encourage the ones that we love to find their voice in the process. That helps to empower them and encourage them to make decisions in their own care. This is also really incredibly important. Oftentimes, sometimes either if we're living with PI, sometimes my son will say to me, well, can you just decide? Because I don't want to make any more decisions today. And maybe as adults, heck, as an adult, sometimes in my own life, I'm like, can somebody else just make a decision today? Because I don't want to do it anymore. But encouraging folks to make the decisions in their care is really critically important. And then lastly, seek help and support. I know I've emphasized this point a couple of times, but the IDF community honestly was something that really was a lifesaver to my family. I'm not sure we could have navigated everything that we have had it not been for the support of both the IDF staff and also the community, like all of you. Know that you are not alone in this process. There are many others like me, like many moms and dads and spouses and friends in your communities that understand what it's like. And even if it isn't PI centered, there's lots of caregivers in this world who care for others with a variety of issues going on. And you know what I found is that we have a lot of commonalities. We are so much more alike than we are different. But goodness, when we're able to connect with somebody, especially in the PI community that just gets it, it really changes our worldview, I think, and really helps us to keep going. Make sure that you utilize the IDF resources available to you on primaryimmune.org. Locate a local support group for caregivers, so not only throughout the IDF community, but for different caregiving types of situations. And you can find many of them online as well in this time. And again, I'll say it one more time, do not hesitate to reach out to seek professional help. Look for a therapist, look for somebody who maybe has some experience in working with chronic conditions and maybe even working with caregivers. And so that could be a way to really help. And lastly here, I put my contact information on this slide here. So if anyone needs anything, I am more than happy to help. You are able to reach out and I would provide any kind of help or support that I'm able to.
Thank you, Becky. That was wonderful. Now we have some time for some questions, and we have some very good questions here for you. The first one is, as a caregiver, how can I communicate with my adult patient that I also need time for myself without hurting their feelings?
That's an incredibly good question. I think first and foremost, honesty is so important. And, you know, just being able to say, I really need some time. I think just being transparent and honest, and maybe even sharing that, you know, you need to be able to recharge too, and that's okay. And sometimes there are guilty feelings that might come along with that. You know, as a mom, sometimes for me to say like, oh my gosh, I just need to go make a Target run and get out of the house, right? Just for a few minutes. Sometimes I felt some guilt about that, but I realized that that was really good to advocate for myself and what I need. If it does that conversation with one another about where is that coming from? Is that coming from a place that maybe, you know, you're the person that you're caring for also wishes they could do that thing. Sometimes they're feeling a sense of loss in that, or even grief. So it's kind of twofold. On one hand, being able to express your need for being able to have that time, but then also maybe trying to understand from the patient perspective why that might bother them, or why that might hurt their feelings, for example, because chances are it's rooted in something else.
Here's another question. Thank you, Becky, for that one. Is it normal to have feelings of resentment as a caregiver? I feel very selfish when I think about how my life could be different if I didn't have someone depending upon me. How can I stop these feelings?
Oh gosh, that's a good question too. I don't know that we can stop those feelings necessarily. And the thing is, I think developing some like those kinds of powerful emotions like resentment being one of them, it's also tied to grief, right? Because you're grieving the loss of a life that maybe that you had planned out. And so if we looked at it as just simply resentment, that's one thing, and we just have to sometimes experience that. But I think more powerfully, oftentimes the emotion associated is that grief. And so what I know about emotions is that the more we fight against them or try to get them to go away, the more we give power to them, the bigger they become. And so sometimes it's just important to sit with that and maybe ask yourself, okay, what is causing me to feel this resentment? Is it in fact grief? Maybe do some journaling around, what is it that you have lost? And sometimes it's helpful to sort of reframe that as well. Like think about, I'll take, for example, the pandemic. So there are lots of things that many of us can relate to, for example, that it feels like we've lost in this process. However, there's some really cool things that we've also gained. And so it might also just, your life might just look a little different than you had planned, but it can also be very beautiful.
I have a younger sibling that I am caring for. I worry constantly about how they will manage if something happens to me, and it does give me a lot of anxiety. So what can I do to help with this anxiety?
Oh, that's a good question too. You guys have the best ones today. I first of all want to say that that's a really normal anxiety to be experiencing, especially when you do have someone that really depends on you. A few strategies that might be helpful in this regard is to talk about your anxiety. Depending on how old your sibling is and what the situation is, maybe you can talk about that together, and maybe you could work on developing a plan for what happens in the event that maybe you got sick, for example, of, maybe you just got a cold and couldn't be around that person. And so like, how would you work through that, and how, who would care for that person in the event that you had to step away, or even in the event that you needed to take a break. And so maybe having those conversations together, if you're able to do that. There's also lots of strategies around just the idea of the emotion of anxiety and what you can do when that crops up. So planning would be a good and important part to the best of your ability, but also being able to do some deep breathing, making sure that you're working through that emotion. Maybe you see a therapist and you talk through this and you work toward developing a plan for what would happen in that event. And then obviously, again, talking with the person that you're caring for, if you're able to do that.
How can I encourage independence between myself and my child with PI while also keeping them safe?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And it would definitely depend, I would say, probably on the age of the child and what they're able to do. I can speak from my own experience and just say that, there have been times when my son really wanted to do something and hang out with his friends, for example, but there were going to be, a lot of kids together, and it was during like a normal flu season, for example. And so there were just certain things that we as parents had kind of made some limitations on. And there were times when we had to just say no, right? And that's really hard because those were not always popular decisions at the time. And then there are other times where a great example of this is my son's a baseball player, and a couple of seasons ago, he wanted to play high school baseball and he wanted to play on a travel team. And then the high school was asking for him to play on a third team. And so we had the conversation with him to say, okay, no, these are really exciting experiences that you're having the opportunity to do. But let's think through this for a second, because that if you're practicing all the time and you're traveling all the time and you're playing, you're going to become exhausted. You're going to be exposed to probably more germs in the process. And what happens when you're exhausted and aren't really taking the best care of yourself in the process? What happens? You get sick. Well, when you get sick, you go to the hospital, and then you need IV treatment, and then you're going to miss a lot of baseball. So even in that example, for that one, we really had to have that conversation of what are the pros and cons of this. And my son was old enough that we let him decide in that case. And so he decided against my thought process, even though we said, here's kind of the pros and cons. He acknowledged them, but he decided to play on 3 teams. And guess what happened within a few weeks? He got sick. He ended up going to the hospital, needing IV treatments for several days. And he said, oh man, Mom, you were so right about that. And that wasn't one of those things I wanted to be right about necessarily, but that experience was one where we felt it was safe enough to allow him to try and make mistakes. And it was in our experience, it was within reason for him to allow him that opportunity. And now, last year, he had a similar opportunity presented to himself, and he was able to say, thank you for those opportunities, but I think I'm going to have to stick with 1 and not the 3. But it was because he learned. And so there are times when we're able to allow the people that we care for those opportunities to kind of live and to make some of those mistakes, if you will, and to learn from them. And there are other times when it's not safe to do that in any way. The other thing I would add is obviously all of that was done in consultation with my son's physicians and immunologists and things like that. So those are always good team partners, when you're trying to navigate how do we allow our young person to be a young person, but also keep them safe.
Thank you. Next question. How might COVID-19 impact the relationship between caregivers and patients?
Well, goodness, I think, I have been saying this for a while now in some of the presentations I've been giving for the IDF, that I think the whole world is finally now catching on to many of the things that we as patients and caregivers have been experiencing all along, right? Like just being more careful about germs and having to take extra precautions than most and washing our hands more than most and just being super duper careful. But in the day and age now that we're living in with this pandemic, like it can change the dynamic very much, because I think many of us are much more, it feels like, very isolated, and we are having to make more careful decisions about where we go and who we're around, and are we able to spend holidays with our extended family, and how that might look different, and whoever you're caring for might have a different perspective on that. And so these are all things that are going to be so important to talk through, and just know that being able to stay connected, as we talked about earlier, through healthy and safe means to do it, even if it's electronic, although it's not the same as being able to always hug our loved ones or sit around a table with everyone at the holidays or whatever that might look like for you. There are times when I think we can still make it super beautiful anyways, and try to find the good in spite of the difficulties that the pandemic is creating for so many of us.
And this is the last question. So if anybody has additional questions, please add them now. This person is asking for us to flip back to the slide with your contact information on it so that they can copy that down.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So while people are copying that information down, then we will say that this session, unfortunately, has come to an end. Becky, wonderful presentation, wonderful information, and I would like to thank Becky for joining us today and sharing her knowledge and experience. So everyone, enjoy the afternoon and visit the exhibit hall and take a little break. And we'll see you at the next session. Take care.